Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss these things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, art, mechanics, etc., is off limits unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford, author, tortured genius, and also your host. And today I'm joined once more by John Kernan as we continue our cycle on coming-of-age stories with a look at Good Will Hunting.
Hi, I'm a less tortured genius, but
Still a
he's gotta
genius.
move past this because it's not his fault.
I can almost count on you to say something I should expect but don't at the beginning of every episode. For those of you who aren't aware, few as you likely are, Good Will Hunting is a 1997 drama written by Ben Affleck and Matt Damon and directed by Gus Van Sant, whose name I probably just said wrong. The movie follows the eponymous Will Hunting, who is a mathematical genius who is discovered by an MIT professor whilst working as a janitor at the university, and his sort of subsequent journey to overcome his personal traumas and accept his gifts and potential with the help of a psychologist. That's the basic rundown of it anyway.
Yeah, it's uh it's not it's not easy being a tortured genius. The
No,
psychology of it is interesting to see, even if they could go deeper into it. I mean, it's only one movie. What are you gonna do?
yeah. Now, you might think, audience, that this is an odd choice for a story in a cycle of coming of age stories, but I do think it counts. Maybe the age bracket it follows is a little older, that is very slightly older than you might expect, but it is a story about maturing, moving on from the past, and growing up as a result. Will is a young adult.
Specifically for somebody whose circumstances have stunted him from doing that, as
Exactly.
he might otherwise have done it a lot sooner.
Absolutely. And Will is a young adult. He is in a transitional phase in his life. So I think it does count, and I do think a important facet of coming of age stories is that they are, whilst they can be about growing older and often are, they're more about growing up, and
Yeah,
that and growing
it's
older are not necessarily the same thing.
no, the most important part of coming of age isn't you coming of age, it's the coming of age, the event, the transition into a new, more hopefully more matured and complete stage of life for
Exactly.
you.
I I've thought for a while that it's almost a mislabeling, right? Because the passage of time, whilst often relevant, isn't the central point. The point of a coming of age story isn't you hit a magic number and you're an adult now, or you're in X next stage of your life now. The point is you overcome something, you learn something, and you mature as a person, and that maturation is what marks the transition, not the ticking of the clock.
Yeah, in a way, it's a much more mundane, almost in a way, microcosm of at least the beginning and end of like the hero's journey, if you will. You got to go through some stuff and you have to come back not the same person you were. Not necessarily a completely different person, but if you don't go through some pretty significant changes, you can't really call it a coming of age.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is recognized as a coming of age story. Like, it's on Wikipedia's list of coming of age stories. After I finished watching the movie on Stan, not sponsored, that's just the streaming service I watched it on. Uh, all of a sudden, I had a whole extra playlist appear of coming of age stories.
Google's always watching, always listening.
So we're not alone in thinking it counts, clearly, but I do think it's definitely not one of the first things people would think of when they think coming of age story.
Yeah, people always think of college kids, not college, or I mean, of regular kids, not college students, and definitely not And definitely not janitors.
You get more like young adult into true adult, for want of a better word.
Let me
Right?
tell you,
But
when I was a janitor, nobody appreciated my genius, that's for sure.
I mean, I somewhat appreciate you.
That's good enough.
But yeah, usually we talked about this a bit, I think, before. Usually these stories come in one of two flavors. It's child becoming teenager or teenager moving into the beginning stages of adulthood. But absolutely, I think, arguably more focus, I think, should go to this particular point of young adult into being a functional adult, a like proper, recognized by society adult, because I think that's a bigger jump in a lot of ways.
That's true. Honestly, I would say it is. It's a stage with finality because you physically can't go back to being a kid, but unless you came from like a pretty sheltered, lucky place that's waiting for you to come back any moment you want to begin with, once you truly step into that world of adulthood, put yourself out there and try to like be something, you really can't go back from that. You could try, but emotionally, psychologically, it's really not something that generally works. There are far too many stories you can see of the people who do, and it not only doesn't work, it damages them badly. Once you're in, you're in.
Yeah, the expectations people have for like late teens, early 20s at university, I personally feel aren't that different from the expectations people have of like your last years in high school. They really are. Like, there's a bit more autonomy and responsibility involved for sure, but the difference between that transition and the transition from, say, completing or not completing, depending your degree, and moving to the workforce is much bigger. Even if you don't go to university, when you're in that like age bracket of the late teens, early 20s, people still expect you in a lot of ways to act more or less the same. By the time you're getting into like your mid to late 20s, that ship has sailed. People aren't going to be giving you passes anymore.
Yeah, unless you're in specific careers, specific kinds of schools. Hell, to a point, even when you are in those careers and schools, a student is always expected to be a student, even if they're a more serious student. They give you the same kind of leeway, expect the same kind of like things of goofing off and having fun. They're still going to give you that little bit of wiggle room that kids get, even if you are a little older. But that's also the very, very last stage of life where life will ever coddle you for the vast majority of people. And even a little bit, once that's over, you're into it. Your only choice after that is to live life. Whereas when you're a student, even a tough student, there are some ways in which you don't have to yet, usually.
Which is one of the things that makes Will interesting, right? Is because he is one of the few who didn't really get that buffer period.
No, he had to get right into just living, and just living was also never very nice for him to begin with.
Yeah, he, spoilers ish for a 1997 movie, I guess, was violently
Spoilers for the movie
abused.
we're here to talk about for over an hour.
Yeah, he was violently abused as a child, which that makes you grow up fast to begin with. You know, as lived largely independently and in a low financial. God, that was a terrible way to phrase that. You know, not in a wealthy area for sure. So he grew
No,
up very fast. He grew up poor, and
he grew
he
up damaged.
learned. Yeah, for it's harsh to say, but grew up damaged because of his circumstances, and that made him, one, stagnant, and two, it made it very difficult for him to really put himself out there and trust, and therefore meant he kind of kept his gifts to himself Not
Yeah.
entirely. Like, people obviously knew he was incredibly smart, but he wasn't really willing to put the gift out into the world.
For the
Eh,
most part, people thought he was incredibly smart the same way that you think a street grifter who can talk somebody out of their money in 10 seconds must be really smart.
Yeah,
Nobody really understood the scope or depth of his intellect.
yeah,
And honestly, I don't think he did either, which is a very consistent thing we see with coming of age stories. And we talked about it a lot, even in a more abstract sense, in the very first episode of the cycle, where like that he doesn't actually know himself yet. He knows he's he knows he's smart, but he definitely doesn't think he's a genius. He he has a little bit of that genius arrogance in there, and that he sees a bunch of other people not understanding stuff that's easy to him, and it's easy for him as a result to kind of think he's surrounded by idiots all the time, even though he doesn't want to admit it. He doesn't really think that about his friends for the most part. He likes them, but you look at stuff like, I don't know, I get the sense that he kind of looks at, for instance, like the students who can't or won't try to solve the problem on the board with some disdain and stuff like that.
yeah.
But despite having that there, he doesn't think he's a genius. He doesn't he doesn't look at college and going into a career and being recognized as something he could do and is capable of, despite seeing all the other people who are doing it being kind of beneath him.
That's the thing, right? Is that there is an arrogance and conceitedness to him because he sees how much more intelligent he is than people. He sees how easy the things that others struggle with are to him when it comes to just raw logic. He's incredibly well read, and he does sort of, by and large, look at other people as lesser, as though they aren't really worth his time. But that's not because he thinks highly of himself. It's because he has so much deep-seated self-loathing that it's easier to use arrogance and conceit as a wall to put between himself and other people. It's easier for him to say, "Of course, I don't want to interact with these people. I don't want to get to know this girl because, in a couple of weeks, I'm gonna find out she can't possibly think at the same level I can. I'm gonna start finding her boring, and it's gonna blow up in my face anyway." It's a lot easier for him to say that than to say, "I am afraid to open up to this person and let them know me as an individual because of what
Yeah,
I've gone
he's
through."
so emotionally closed off.
And that's why this is a coming of age story. It's because he is at a point of transition. Because he's moving away from being the young adult, the student age, into into being an adult for real.
And
And
he's been stuck where he is for a long time
yeah, but
with no stimulus, no help to open him up.
yeah, that's where he is transitioning in the timeline. Mentally, he's probably transitioning from like his early teens directly into adulthood.
Yeah, he's having to skip a couple steps.
And he has to learn to move past the stagnancy and the trauma that has defined so much of his life up to that point, to let it go, and in doing so mature as a person. And that's the growing up we're talking about here. Not to say that having
Yeah.
trauma means you'll never grow, like you can't grow up with baggage, because realistically speaking, he's still going to be haunted by what he experienced for a long time, maybe even forever. That's not the point. The point is that he's no longer going to let that define him and hold him prisoner. He's allowing himself to grow as a person by the end of the movie.
Absolutely. And like I think it actually ties in with a lot of similarly based but otherwise completely different issues have, where I think when it comes to emotionally open up, at least the biggest of Will's problems is expectations. With people who have been hurt a lot over and over again, constantly had any expectations they might have had dashed, whether regardless of what it's in, reach this weird bit of like, I wouldn't call it actual apathy, but almost pseudo apathy, where you become terrified of expecting anything from anyone to the point where you just refuse to. You don't, because the second you start to think about having expectations, you can only have bad ones. So instead, you just go through convincing yourself you don't want or need anything from anyone, and you shouldn't, because they're not going to give you anything. And if you try, you're just going to be disappointed.
I mean, I would argue that that is the opposite of apathy because that is having expectations and they are negative. Fear
Well, that's
isn't
what I mean,
lack
though.
of
It's like
caring.
you
It means you care a
it's I would
lot.
almost call it attempted apathy. You're trying not to care. You're trying not to have expectations or want anything from anyone,
Yeah, I'd pay that.
but
It's that whole
it
thing with
doesn't
the
work.
walls. No, it's impossible. True apathy is incredibly rare and it's never a good thing.
No,
Uh,
apathy's never helped anybody. Apathy is death.
and yeah, I mean, you said it is about expectations. In fact, it's said in the movie, he went his entire early life being constantly betrayed by the people who were supposed to love and protect him. So he learnt the lesson that you cannot open up to people, you cannot trust, because you will inevitably be betrayed. The reason he is so close with these people who are, they're getting into trouble, their lives are going nowhere. The reason he's so close with them and not people with minds of his own caliber is because those people would never betray him. They would take a bullet for him, they would take a bullet to someone for him.
And their connection is one that can be simple, direct. Yeah, like not only does he know he'll do that stuff for him, but he doesn't even have to consider how he would feel if they didn't.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I don't say that to, like, I realize I'm talking about these guys as though they're, like, so much lesser than Will because they don't have his gifts, but that's not, I mean, they are in some ways, but I don't necessarily mean to imply they're lesser as people, right? They're good
No,
friends
it's
to him.
yeah, but they don't share not only are they probably not as smart as him, but they don't share his interests. They don't really have that much in common other than what they go out and do to have fun together.
Yeah, and the reality of it is that, yeah, they probably aren't going to be doing much different in 20 years. They might have, chilled out a little bit, probably won't be getting into quite as many, like, bar fights and shit. They, Chucky more than the other, it's Chucky, right?
Think so?
The one that's played by Ben Affleck. Something like that. Him
I
especially.
always forget their names.
Yeah, he especially, right, seems that he's actually kind of got a decent head in his shoulders. They're going to be making an honest, and, to use Will's own word, honorable living.
But they don't have ambition.
But they don't have ambition. They don't have the capacity to back up that ambition, even if they did.
They're simple, straightforward guys, which
Yeah,
is exactly what he wants out of them, but also not at all what he is or what you might expect him to consort with if he was being completely true to himself.
exactly. It's almost like he is putting on an act to an extent, putting on a persona, because if he keeps existing within this persona, these people who exist in a different world will continue being loyal.
Yeah, and he seems to think that being like them is also the best he can do. He doesn't have his issue with expectations applies to everybody. He refuses to have expectations of himself either. And so that's how he tries to live.
But, my favorite scene in the movie, right? And I think the most important, most impactful scene isn't even between Will and Sean, his therapist. It's between Will and the character whose name I'm thinking is Chucky, or something along those lines. They're on break at their, like, demolition, I think they're doing, job, like leaning against the car, just sort of talking about things, and Will sort of goes on about, this is what my life's gonna be. I'm in 20 years from now, we're gonna be doing the same thing, except maybe we'll be taking our kids to Little League together. And his friend turns around and goes, like hell you will be. If that is what you're doing in 20 years, I will kill you.
I will kick your ass. Yeah, I love it. Everybody needs that friend.
And Will is completely baffled, right? And he's like, he sort of starts saying, you could be so much more than this, and you should be. And Will is like, what? Because I owe it to myself? And he turns around and goes, now fuck that. You owe it to us. Because
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly how he phrases it, but he's basically saying, you slumming it with us, for want of a better word, the way you are, it's like you're mocking us. You are wasting an opportunity that you have been born with, that you are lucky to have, and you are wasting that when any one of us, any one of the people at this construction or demolition site, whichever one it is, would kill to have what you have.
Yeah. And I don't think he outright says it, but that you get that funny realization of like, hey, don't think just because these guys aren't as smart as you means they're not smart enough to see how smart you are. That doesn't mean like you're here because they trust you trust them and they care about you. Part of caring about you means they have recognized you. They know who you really are. You can't hide it.
That's why this is such an important scene for a couple of reasons, right? One, it's the first time this guy has ever challenged Will.
Yeah, that's part of
Which
why
is
he hangs
something
out with
that,
them because they don't ever challenge
yeah,
him.
and that's something that Sean Maguire, the therapist, has said to Will a couple of scenes earlier. Is like, yeah, no, that guy, he's your friend, sure, he's your buddy, but he's never challenged you, and you need that. Everyone needs that person who will sit there and call them on their shit. So it's a big deal when his friend does, because it's a wake-up call for Sean. Not for Sean, for Will. It's a wake-up call for the audience, who by design, to an extent, have not been taking this guy seriously enough through the movie. And it is sort of saying, it doesn't matter, like, yeah, you put your walls up, but this guy, he knows you. You've known this guy since you were children, it seems to me like. Anyway, they've been together for a long time.
And you've really been unintentionally looking down on your friends, especially him, by never expecting your understanding of each other to be any more than it was, by thinking that just because you might be more conventionally like intelligent, book smart, so to speak, than him, that he can't recognize you for who you really are, and that your friendship isn't anything deeper than going to work and going and having your fun.
Yeah, it's a moment that says to him, you can't hide. People do know you, they do know your value. And I think more than any other moment in the movie, even more than the famous not your fault scene, that is the turning point for Will. And it's so good.
Really good.
Because that's the moment where he realizes he has to take he has to take the help he is being offered seriously. Both the opportunities he's getting from Lambo, and also the help as a person, as an individual, the therapeutic psychological healing help he is getting from Sean Maguire.
Yeah, and also has to acknowledge? Oh boy.
Yeah, that
Oh
was
man,
something.
my brain tried to jump to realize and acknowledge at the same time, and here we are.
And
I love dyslexia.
I'm not gonna edit it out.
I would be disappointed if you did, but he 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 has to acknowledge also that like not just that he needs the help and should accept it, but that it's real help. He has to come to realize that these people are genuinely trying to help him and that they recognize him too, not just his friend. They see what he could be. They want to help him get there. And they deserve the respect and acknowledgement of letting them try to help him because they are giving him the respect and acknowledgement he's been denying himself this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, every character in this movie, just about, is in some way trying to give Will what he has been denying himself for his entire life. Because he can't bring himself to forgive himself for things that weren't his fault. He can't bring himself to trust. He can't bring himself to have expectations for himself or others. But here we've got Lambo, who's a problem in a lot of ways. and we'll get to that, I'm sure. But who
Not
is
the
like,
nicest man.
yeah, who's like, I am blown away by you. Like, it would be a waste for someone with your intellect to continue cleaning floors for the rest of your life. You have something incredibly special, and you have a duty to use that to do something. You know, which there's some problems with that for sure. But he's taking that step to acknowledge Will's genius and to give him opportunities, which he has been lacking because he's not allowed himself to have them.
Like, it's good because, on the one hand, you should have the right to live your life however you want. Just because you're smart doesn't mean you should have to pursue, like, for instance, intellectual things you might not be passionate about or something like that. But at the same time, I don't know, like, on the chance that that would be what you would be passionate about and would be what make you happy, you at least have a responsibility to let yourself be out there, let yourself feel around and see what it is you want to put that intelligence towards, what is going to pull that passion out of you.
Yeah, you've got Skylar, who is like, I don't give a shit about your genius or whatever. I just want I like you as a person. You know, I enjoy your humor and your company, and I want to know more of you.
You can be
Which,
as smart as dumb or as you want, as long as you keep being this person that I enjoy.
yeah, exactly. You've got the person we're calling Chucky, whoever he is, and his sort of crew there,
Listen,
who are like,
Chucky's the best friend in Rugrats. Why can't he be the best friend here?
and they're like, yeah, we're loyal, and we know you in a very similar vein as Skylar. It's not exactly the same. It's more like, we respect you as you. You will have our loyalty even without the walls and the facade. And of course, you've got Sean Maguire, the therapist, who is kind of exemplifies all of the above.
Yeah,
The idea that,
because he's gone through some similar stuff.
yeah, exactly. The idea that that he can heal, that he can move past the horrible things that have happened in his life and grow and mature as a person. He doesn't have to be stagnant and stay that same person forever. And Maguire is proof of that, because he's been there and he has grown a lot. But one of my favourite things about Maguire is that he still has growing himself to do as well.
Yeah, he's not completely past what he's been through, and like the acknowledgement we get of that is part of why he's so invested in Will, why he doesn't want to see him keep denying himself and doing what he's done, is because he's been through it already, and he came so close to turning away and making a terrible mistake that later on he recognized just how big a mistake it would have been, how close he came to never having the best, happiest experience of his life. But now that that's been taken away from him unwittingly, and he's not even close to over that, that makes him extra unable to stand the thought of Will making the mistakes he almost did and making the mistakes he actually did make.
Yeah, he is an excellent mentor figure for Will, and at the same time, he is a signifier to him and to the audience that that when you're dealing with these deep-seated issues, the grief and the trauma and the things that like hurt you to your soul, it's not going to be an overnight fix. It is an ongoing process that you are always contending with and working on growing past. And that's okay. You can still grow and mature as a person.
Yeah.
And
just
Will needs
because
to
it's
see
not
that.
going to go away doesn't mean you can't move past it either.
Yeah, which is something that Will needs in his life. He needs to see that. And I really like that the mentor figure in this movie still isn't stagnant. He has experienced an arc of his own, small and comparatively insignificant as it may be. And he's not the only one. Lambo is better by the end of it. We don't get to see his growth as much, right? But we know that between the argument he has and the next time with Sean, the next time he shows up on screen, he's better for it. He's coming to the realization that he has a conceit to him, and he is trying to live a little bit vicariously through Will because
Yeah,
he's
because what he
terrified of
puts
failure.
will towards is what he thinks he should have had.
Yeah, his whole thing is he's afraid of failure, and by the end of the movie, he's realized that, and he's learned to recognize that Sean isn't a failure because he chose something simpler.
Yeah, it
'Cause,
honestly fits that the psychology is such a big aspect of this movie because when you think about it, Lambo and Sean are two very different they're two very specific sides of fatherhood, if you will, in relation to Will, very, very strongly distilled. Instead of having one father figure, he's got two father figures that are both pushing towards very different ideas that he needs to confront and express, and they're doing it differently. In that Lambo, he's got some of the good parts, but he also has one of the toxic aspects of fatherhood that's all too common. Of I want this kid to have all the things I never have, but should have had and wanted. And then in parentheses, you put, even if that's not what he wants.
yeah,
And then, Sean is, there's very little toxicity there, but there's also still that little element of, damn it, I want what's best for you. And I am going to make sure you at least know that and have a push towards it, even if I have to push hard.
yeah. I mean, what my favorite thing about Lambo, right, is that yeah, we don't really get to see that growth, which is a kind of sad, I suppose. But there's only so much time in the movie. But after he has that argument with Sean and he goes away, and we know he's done some reflecting because when he comes back, they go out for a beer together. They're joking
Yeah.
together. He has clearly accepted that Sean is not a failure, and he doesn't really mention Will at all. He has let go of that, and that is growth. And ultimately, that is what this movie is all about. It's about maturing and growing, and that's why it's a coming of age movie.
Yeah. And although the main characters who are going through this stuff for the most part in this movie are all men, it also is nice that it's not like none of this is like totally male specific experiences. Like it's stuff anybody could go through and understand. It's just in this case, Will is a dude and his mentor figures are dudes because I think like it's a shame to say it, but I think it's the stuff that he was missing that he needed shown to him are on regardless of how you look at it, archetypical aspects of fatherhood. Not that I don't, not that I think parenthood should really be divided up into motherhood and fatherhood, but like for story elements, writing elements, these are the things they tend to pull from.
Just before I go on, just a side note. Sorry if you guys can hear the massive amounts of wind that have kicked up in the background. One day I'll record somewhere where it doesn't get windy indoors, but today is not that day. Uh,
Maybe you'll record not in Australia?
uh, probably not. But it'll be in a room that is sealed. I
It'll
mean,
be in a nice
well
room.
sealed. Anyway, but I'm glad you touched on the fact that both Will and his mentors are masculine, right? Because I think that the movie is really quite ahead of its time in a lot of ways, in that it was willing to explore the fact that, yeah, there's putting on this tough facade, this bravado, isn't healthy. It was willing to explore the idea that men have emotions, deep seated painful feelings that they need to explore in healthy ways because you don't think about it much probably, but there was not a lot of that in the even into the late 90s.
No, and in a lot of cultures, it's still all too common a problem today.
I mean, it is in general. It's still people still have a lot of unrealistic expectations of what masculinity is, for sure.
Yeah, there's a reason we've reached a point in life where tough guy is almost a purely derogatory term. Nobody says it as a compliment.
Yeah, we've come a long way, for sure. There's still a long way to go, but media now is a lot better about portraying that sort of thing outside of, like, war movies.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago that, you weren't really allowed to have men be emotional about anything that wasn't napalm or the death of their father.
Yeah, or their kids. You you were allowed to be it was treated as if you were allowed to be three things: a warrior, a protector, or a father, which coincidentally are also all three things that in the typical expectations people used to have overlap a lot. Not actually as much variety there as it sounds like when I
Yeah.
say three different things.
This is a movie that let a male character who lives a, by and large, very traditionally masculine, or at least how we view it, life in a lot of ways. He goes out with his buddies, he has a band, he has that brotherhood vibe, he gets drunk, he pursues women, and is
He doesn't
frankly
understand
quite
women.
childish in a lot of ways. But he was allowed to be a victim, and that is a big deal because
Yeah,
up until fairly recently, men did not get portrayed as victims very often, and that contributed to a lot of societal problems that we're still working through.
yeah, it's unfortunate, but because at least statistically the vast majority of like victimizers are men, it makes it harder to be ready to see men as victims in a lot of cases, especially for people who, unfortunately, for one reason or another, have already been abused by men at some point in their lives. But, this movie is a good reminder that, like, regardless of what the statistics are, at the end of the day, people are people. Anybody can be hurt, anybody can be damaged, and anybody can get stuck because they're hurt and they're afraid.
Yeah, I think because of that alone and how well it does it, this movie does deserve its reputation as kind of a classic, and I think it fit an important place in media, especially when it came out, because it was, again, it's kind of depressing just to think about in a lot of ways, given that it was 1997 and not 67. It was quite ahead of its time in what it was willing to show and how it was willing to show it. Do I think it was a perfect movie? No.
It's definitely not.
No, there are flaws that are there, and if you think about them, you're definitely going to notice them, and we're probably going to get into some of those in a second. But
Mhm.
I think I would classify this as an important movie.
Definitely.
A movie with the technical proficiency that you have to respect, both in the writing and the performances. Not that we're really going to get into those because we don't do that here, and in what it was saying and when it was saying it.
I think everything you just said is actually a big part of why, even though it might not be the most personal and emotional scene, that the most iconic scene from the movie may be the whole "not your fault" thing, because that bit of brotherhood, that recognition, while amazing and felt so good, is at least something that's universal enough that a lot of other stories have that moment there. They're much like it is one of the ways in which this movie was ahead of its time. Like you said, is there weren't really that many stories out there that were willing to just blatantly acknowledge on your face, on the face, like, yeah, you're a victim, because that's kind of what that is. It's people always want to blame themselves for the awful things they go through for a lot of reasons. Like, you wanna be responsible. You don't wanna feel like you're somebody who just puts everything off on someone else and goes, "Oh, well, this bad thing happened to me, and I went through this because life is unfair, or I just got really unlucky and I have to deal with the fact that I got really unlucky, it's usually a lot easier, at least in the moment, to in some way internalize, well, life is what you make of it and you have to do your best, which means I am responsible for the things that happen to me. And like sometimes that's a healthy attitude to have, but it doesn't apply to everything. Sometimes bad shit does happen. Sometimes it's just not your fault and you have to move past it, but you can only move past it by accepting it. Because no matter how much you think you're moving on, no matter how much you just keep on walking, it hangs on you. It becomes a weight. And if you keep doing that, you're going to accumulate more and more weight until it first trips you. And if you let it, eventually it can crush you.
Yeah. Acceptance isn't meant to be like psychological acceptance. I mean, isn't supposed to be taking everything onto yourself and going, I'll just deal with it. It's meant to be taking responsibility for the things you can control and acknowledging that there are things, that there are actions that are not within your control and that you are not responsible for them. You can only be responsible for the things that you have control over. And
Yeah.
if you were doing everything right, you have nothing to feel guilty about.
And even if you weren't doing everything right, you can't just blame it all on
Yeah,
yourself.
I should clarify. If you're trying your best to do everything right.
Yes. Yeah, and like I think there really still aren't even that many stories now, although a lot more than there were back then. Back then there were very, very few stories, especially stories that were centered around a man that were willing to do exactly what Sean Maguire does in that story and look a victim dead in the face and remind them, even if forcefully, it's not your fault.
Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. That the scene with his friend is the most impactful. It's the big turning point with the character. It's my personal favorite for sure for a lot of reasons. But the scene with, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic scenes, but the scene toward the end with Will and Sean, the well renowned, famous, even if you haven't seen this movie, it's not your fault scene, was a huge deal, and it's a big part of why we remember this movie, because it's not just allowing this male character to be emotional and vulnerable and acknowledged as a victim. It's another male character extending a hand in a healthy, emotionally honest and vulnerable way, and acknowledging that he too himself was a victim. Will isn't an isolated incident. It's
Not even close.
Yeah, it's a very poignant scene, and I'm very glad it happened. That being said, I have to admit, Will's breakthrough does feel a bit too abrupt. And how
Yeah, it feels like the
quickly
movie needed another 20 minutes.
Yeah, and how quickly and readily he makes that leap and gets. Now, I understand, right? He had been growing up to this point. It was subtle, but there was growth. It wasn't like this came completely out of nowhere. But it was a very massive leap very suddenly. And the reality of the situation is that that's not how psychological healing really works for most people.
No, the breakthrough and realization that you've had all the tools you need to succeed and find your own happiness beside you, and all you have to do is properly use them, doesn't immediate realization doesn't immediately translate into practical use and success. There's yeah, I know we're talking about all this being a transitional period, but that's the thing is you still have to transition after that breakthrough, after that wake up.
I mean, a sudden breakthrough in and of itself is rare. It is a very long, gradual, and frequently barely perceptible process. You don't just have this aha moment of inspiration, like an inventor suddenly coming to an idea for changing the world, except the world is yourself.
And
It's
we're lucky that that's one pitfall we don't have to worry about here, if only because that's most of what this movie is.
yeah,
It is all those small, little, subtle moments that are kind of knocking Will on the head and pushing him bit by bit towards the realization.
but yeah, you don't have this sudden jolt of realization and then everything's okay.
Yeah.
It's more like
There's-
things get better very slowly and gradually, and then a year later, you realize how far you've actually already come.
Yeah.
And then you still keep going because you're not done yet. I think that Sean himself is a good example of that, but that's not he's not the focus of the movies. Will is. So this very sudden breakthrough kind of hits you, and you're like, that seems a little too easy. That he was just told it's not his fault a few times, and suddenly he's okay and he's gotten over all of this, because that's not what it would really be like. Now, it's understandable why it is the way it is. It's not easy to translate a years long journey into a 2-hour film. They had to condense things, and I do think the story handles Will's growth well enough. But it does need a bit of an asterisk because it's setting a bit of an unhealthy, unrealistic standard to assume that you're going to just magically have this sudden realization and then not need your therapist anymore and everything will be okay, because that's not the way it happens in reality.
No, the wake up is about setting you on the right path, getting you going in the right direction. You still have to do the going.
Yeah, and it's
It
going to
doesn't make the
take you
path
time.
shorter.
It's not gonna. It's probably not like when you're dealing with events that are as deeply traumatic as what Will went through. He's going to be working through that for years, realistically speaking. He's gonna.
Yeah,
He might be more okay going forward, but he's not going to just instantly get over the fact that he was horribly abused and victimized for a huge portion of his life by people he should have been able to trust. He should still have a long journey to go. And like I said, it's a 2-hour film. There's a limit to how well they could really portray this, and I think with the time they had, they did a good job. It's just worth noting. Which is kind of one of only 2 real complaints I have about this movie. I don't know, have you have anything else you want to say on that?
not much.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it just kind of is. It's not really the fault of the movie. It's not that it was badly written. It's just a constraint of the medium.
Yeah, it's I mean, that's like I said, movie needed another 20 minutes. Movie's not unfinished, but it could have been, and I would say deserves to have been, a little longer to properly hit the home run there at the end.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of diving before this. It was not easy for them to get this movie picked up and made in the first place. So some of it probably came down to this is as much time as they were going to get. And I respect that they did as well as they did with this particular story with a smaller window as they had. It would probably have been an incredible book.
Oh, absolutely.
The only other thing, right, is that I feel like we have to acknowledge that while the story ends with Will going after Skylar, his maybe getting the girl at the end isn't a victory. That's not what marks that Will is moving on and has grown up and is matured and is ready to embrace his life. It's not the relationship, maybe. It's never confirmed if he actually gets together with Skylar. It's assumed he does. It's dangerous to equate a relationship with overcoming your trauma. It's not getting the girl. It's that he was willing to take the risk.
It's the fact that he was willing to go after her and that he was ready to open himself up, even if it meant risking getting hurt and not 100% going after what his supposed potential is, like Lambo was originally pushing him towards. He is still going to chase that potential, But this isn't necessarily the most direct and straightforward way he could do that because he's doing what you are really supposed to do and pursuing what he wants, what he thinks and feels would make him happy. And in addition to all the other potential things he could do where he's going, right now that's Skylar.
Yeah, it's the fact he is willing to trust, to open up again, to take the risk that after everything he did, she will turn him down and he will just be jobless, heartbroken, and alone in California. That's the sign that he has grown, that he is okay and capable of taking on that risk and prepared for the negative possibility, the potential negative outcome. That's
And
the
we
sign
can
of
be
his growth.
confident that he's probably not going to hit that potential outcome because he has always had the tools he needed to succeed. And now he's ready and willing to use them.
Yeah, and we got to see Skylar alone as the audience, and how heartbroken she was at the idea of him not going there. Like, we know that she desperately probably still wants him to be there. He didn't get to see that. He's taking a jump. And
And
because
that's exactly
it's,
what he needs.
again, this isn't something wrong with the writing, though. Like, I think it's very well written. It's just that it's worth making a note of in analysis, because it's very subtextual, and I think it would be very easy for people to misconstrue that it was him going after Skylar and maybe getting the girl that was the sign of his maturation and him making it, him succeeding. And I find that that take is not just wrong, but it would be very reductive. You know, it would be, if that was what the movie was saying, it would spit in the face of everything that came before it. But that's not what the movie is saying. It is a symbolic thing. It is the fact that that Skylar agreed to take him back isn't a sure thing. That is the important thing to latch onto there. That he's taking
And that's
the leap.
what McGuire's part in the story was about too, talking about his past. Like, you know, why didn't you why didn't you pursue this? Why didn't you live up to this ambition? Well, I went to see about a girl, and I don't regret it.
Yeah, it's the movie was never about Will becoming the next Einstein or Tesla or whoever you want. It was never about him changing the world with his genius. That's not the point of the movie. It's the inciting incident that he is a genius, but the point of the movie is he has to be willing to let the walls down. He's got to be willing to take risks, to put himself as he is, as the genius, as the victim, all of it, all out there into the world.
Yeah, and
That's
he does have a responsibility to use his intelligence, but not because he has to do the very, very most he absolutely can with the peak of it. It's because his intelligence, his wit means he has the power to do so much, which means he could whatever it is that makes him happy, he has the ability to pursue it and to make it happen. He's got to do it. That's where
despite
his responsibility to use his intelligence comes in,
yeah,
not for the world, but for himself.
despite what his friend told him, despite how great of a seed it was, the only person he owes using his mind to is himself. And it's not that he has to use it in the way that Lambo is talking about, or that his friends are talking about. He has to use it in the way that Sean is talking about. He has to use the gifts he has been given to pursue what he wants from life, instead of just sitting in the same stagnant pool
Yeah.
when there is a whole ocean out there waiting for him.
Yeah, especially when so many people have less tools for that than he does. He doesn't have to settle, which means he shouldn't. I mean, for the most part, people should almost never settle. But there are a lot of situations where, whether it's the ideal or not, settling is sometimes the best you're going to get. And like, that's okay. But like,
Yeah.
somebody who doesn't have to and it's not what they want, at that point basically has a responsibility to themselves not to.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? It'd be one thing if that's what he wanted out of his life. If he was content and happy just to be doing that, what he was already doing, that's fine. But we know from the
Pretty
beginning that
obvious
that's
he
not,
wasn't.
because if that was all he wanted from his life, he wouldn't have solved that puzzle, that problem on the board.
He wouldn't have been working at a university and watching everybody around him and thinking so much about it every day. He would have just been cleaning the spills and going home.
He wouldn't have been reading incredibly complicated educational literature to the point where he can quote just about every genius that's ever lived. You know, it's very clear from early on that he is not pursuing what he really wants out of fear. And that's the crux of the movie, is that he gets over the fear and is willing to take that leap. And that's why, again, this is a coming-of-age story. Because by the end of the movie, he has matured, and he is exiting this transitional phase and becoming who he's going to be for the rest of his life. In theory.
Yeah. Sometimes happiness can fall into your lap and you can have it and accept it, and that's fine. But it is in the pursuit of happiness that it's given true meaning.
Damn, poetic. On that note, though, I think we can probably leave that there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's much more to cover. It's a good movie. I recommend people watch it. It's an important movie. And it is a good coming-of-age story and a good example of a coming-of-age story in a way that we don't generally associate with the term. For now, though, as always, if you are listening to this elsewhere, you can find these episodes as well on my website, radfordwrites.com. I also share stories there and the like, stuff that we've shared on this podcast primarily, but also some other stuff I've written, as well as like blog posts, articles, that sort of thing, and links to my books as well. Naturally, you can also find John on these episodes again. He's going to, that was a terrible way of saying it. He'll be back, is what I'm trying to say.
I like this show. It's a good show. I'm in it.
You can also find him streaming as Sephear, Sephear, on Twitch. Twitch? It's Twitch, right?
It is Twitch.
Nailed it.
And probably gonna put some stuff up on YouTube, but you know, first I have to have more stuff to put and have my editor comb through it when they are not too busy.
All right. Well,
Hooray.
see you next time.
Bye.